Shaftesbury Society, the John Locke Foundation's event that we hold on a regular basis to bring people into here some very interesting topics, and we do have one again today, and this should be a very good presentation, so I'm not going to take too much time, but there are a couple of housekeeping items I want to mention first before my introduction. One is that our latest Civitas poll luncheon is this Thursday here in this same room. If you've not signed up but are interested to know what is happening with the latest Civitas poll, please join us on Thursday. We, of course, will have the latest on the Bud Beasley race. What's happening with the generic congressional races and other interesting items that we have decided to look at this time around. And then I also want to alert you to the next Shaftesbury Society meeting, which has just been confirmed now to take place on October 10th, so a couple of weeks from today. This one will be led by our Carolina Journal staff, and it'll be looking at a discussion of the political landscape as we get closer and closer to early voting and election day. That's October 10th. The event is not yet up on our website, but will be soon, so stay tuned for the announcement of that. Now, turning our attention to today, there's been a lot of talk about millennials, who they are, what they think, how they vote. Well, today we're going to be exploring a topic that's of great interest to a group like the John Locke Foundation that focuses on free markets and limited government. We're asking, what do millennials think about capitalism? And joining us with valuable perspective on this topic is Dr. Christina Elson, standing right next to me. She is Executive Director of the John A. Allison Center for the Study of Capitalism at Wake Forest University. Couldn't be named after a better person. We always enjoy hearing from John Allison when he's in this building, which is always a treat. And I searched this morning for her bio page at Wake Forest because I was going to tell you, where she got the degrees, where she's worked before, and maybe some book titles. But then as I was looking at that page, it was actually much more interesting. So let me tell you a little bit, just a couple of snippets from that page. She has a background not just as an academic, but also an anthropologist and business person. And now I'm actually quoting from that page. Her research career has focused on the creation and dissolution of shared elite identities and on the limits of early states. And more recently, she has initiated projects exploring psychological traits and behaviors that support team success. Not what we normally hear when we're introducing folks up here. So with that in mind, I hope you, like me, are interested to hear what Dr. Christina Elson has to say about today's topic, which is millennials, markets, and the future of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. So some of the data I'm going to share with you today is very recent. So this is the first time I've actually spoken with it publicly, and a lot of it comes from a project that my research collaborator and I started 2 years ago. It's a partnership with YouGov where we're collecting data on millennials and Gen Z through regular polling and asking them different questions. And some of what we're interested in is what I'm going to talk about today. What are millennial views on free markets as they age, since they're 40 now, they're entering middle age. And also, what can we think about in terms of understanding characteristics that contribute to what we might call a capitalist mindset or an entrepreneurial mindset? So how can we think about understanding how those mindsets might develop among younger people? So I'm going to talk today about millennials and the future of free markets. I am going, let's see if I can get this to go, pointed at that. What am I pointing it at?
Click it on. It might go.
Oh.
On the side.
On the side? Got it. I think it's on. Now it's on. There we go. All right. Okay. So this is what we're going to cover today. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm going to talk about who millennials are. I'm going to apologize in advance to any millennials in the room. I'm going to make a few bad millennial jokes on the way. We're going to talk about millennials and liberalism, millennials and capitalism, and then we're going to want to leave time for questions and answers, okay? This is my research collaborator, Dr. Kylie King. She's at University of Champlain in Vermont right now. I'm hoping she will be joining me at Wake Forest next year. Here I am. I actually grew up in North Carolina for part of my youth. My family lived in High Point. My dad taught at High Point University. He was a music professor. He had a degree from Juilliard. Then we moved to Virginia. This is me as a debutante at the age of 21, right? My dad escorted me. My mom made that dress. There's my mom there with me when I graduated from high school. So I grew up in this part of the world. I grew up in North Carolina. I grew up in Virginia. I later left to live in Mexico for 5 years to study anthropology and archaeology. I lived in Puebla, Mexico. I worked in Oaxaca. I worked in Peru. I worked in Guatemala. I worked in a lot of places throughout Latin America. I worked for a while on the island of Cozumel as an illegal immigrant. I lived there and worked in a dive shop. So, and then I found my way to the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, where I was part of the curatorial staff in the anthropology department. I did that while I did my PhD in anthropology at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. So I spent about 7 years in all at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. I later went to Washington, D.C. to work with National Geographic magazine. I spent a lot of time touring around the world as their staff anthropologists, traveling to countries like Laos, like Cuba, like Vietnam, a lot of places working with them on scientific and other kinds of projects that they were doing. I got married, started a family. This is my husband. He's an artist. He's a painter. So we have that kind of diversity. And during COVID, my son and I took up a COVID challenge of learning to fly sailplanes. So we both now have done our open flights. We're students, and we're looking to finish our written tests and actually finish our licenses. So that's been a lot of fun. That's the plane, one of the planes that we learned to train in. So why is capitalism important to me? Well, capitalism is important to me because I've spent a lot of time living in countries like Peru and Mexico and other places that don't have free market systems, right? So, and I've studied a lot of the history of civilizations and cultures and what are the trade-offs among things like democracy and markets and things like that. So my concern with what I see in the U.S. is that, if you look at things like the Freedom Index that the Heritage Foundation and others run, since 2017, the U.S. has been slipping in the rankings of being a free market society. I mean, we're now ranked 25th. We're behind many countries that younger people consider socialist countries, like Sweden and Norway. So we need to think about what are the issues that places like this identify that are hampering economic freedom in the country, tax burden, government spending, trade freedom, things like that, right? These are the issues that are concerning to younger generations, and I want to talk a little bit about how this is influencing what we see in some of the perspectives of millennials. Okay, so who are the millennials? This is my first bad millennial. Why can't millennials take a joke? Anybody know the answer? Because the jokes always hit a little too close to their parents' house. Okay. All right. All right, who are the millennials? Let's really talk about who are the millennials. The millennials are currently aged 26 to 41. They were born between 1981 and 1996. They make up at least 35% of the current workforce, and in a few years, they'll dominate that. They're interested in individualized financial goals, but they also prioritize quality of life, right? So they have a real divergence from baby boomers and older generations, as we've seen on social issues. They're much more liberal around attitudes regarding gender roles, immigration, and racial equality, but they're not necessarily more liberal on things like abortion. They care about the environment and conservation. This is something that we've seen as a constant as they've aged, a real interest in the environment and conservation. Particularly, they're more likely to see climate change as human-induced. They are distrusting of politicians and the government, but at the same time, they often come out as more supportive than their elders of a government role in solving problems that they feel are becoming entrenched and intransigent in our system. And I'll talk about what a few of those big problems are. They're less interested in voting. They've been less involved in voting traditionally. And when they do get involved, they participate in more sporadic and individuated ways than what we would think of from older generations. And when I say older generations in this context, I'm really going to talk mostly about baby boomers and sort of silent generations. Okay. So there's different ways that we can assess millennials. We can compare them to older generations when they were at the same point in life. So we can look at data on, let's say, baby boomers when they were 38 and 40, and we can compare their attitudes and perspectives to what we're seeing with millennials at the same stage in life. We can look at the trajectory of millennials over time. So we can look at data that's been collected about them when they were sort of this 18 to 26-year-old group, this earlier group, right? They were younger, and we can look at how their attitudes are changing as they age. That's another way we can look at them. And then, of course, we can look at them just compared to the general adult population. So sort of where are they now when we want to benchmark them compared to everything else that's going on in the US. So those are some of the things that we're thinking about as we undertake this research project. One thing that we want to sort of couch this discussion is that we know that obviously everyone ages, and as people age, they experience both psychological and other changes that are common to all generations. So really the foundational idea about aging is that people do tend to grow more conservative as they age. This just isn't me saying this. This is widely agreed upon in the literature that looks at aging and sort of viewpoints. And that's due to psychological changes, but it's also due to economic changes, right? So in the past, things like the self-discipline of work, the impact of concerns related to family and work, the accumulation of material assets, homes, things like that, have also contributed to a shift in the development of a more economic conservatism as people age. A recent model that has been proposed synthesizing these approaches that are common across political science, sociology, psychology, and other disciplines suggests that political attitudes probably remain relatively stable across adulthood, but over the long term, changes that occur are more likely to be toward the political right rather than the political left. And so we're curious about the things that can influence that, and we think that there's a very strong economic influence on what will cause that shift to happen, right? So if the economy is working well, if capitalism's working well, that's good, right? So the one question that we're thinking about is, are millennials becoming more conservative? And some of the things that I've listed here are things that, of course, also contribute to your sort of disposition that you, as an 18 to 26-year-old, are sort of starting out in life with. Things like your upbringing, the impact of young adulthood, upward mobility, things like that. And those things, of course, are going to change over time. So the question we have here, are millennials becoming more conservative? Actually, let me go back to this. we have to take into account the idea that we're dealing, first of all, with a group of people who are now entering middle age. The oldest are 40. But when they were in the 18 to 26-year-old category, they experienced what we refer to now as this sort of delayed adulthood, right? And that's due to economic and other social conditions where they didn't, in the same way as baby boomers, start off in life with their full responsibility, and many of them still have a high degree of parental support as young people. And we're going to talk about how that exists going into middle age. So things like this financial independence, this delayed adulthood syndrome is something that both has economic causes and creates consequences for them later in life, right? So we want to talk a little bit about that. Generally, what we see across different generations is that there's been a sliding scale of economic achievement when you look at the silent generation, and I'm talking about compared to people buying homes, people accumulating assets across those kinds of indicators. There's a sliding scale of achievement from silent generation down through the millennial generation, right? When we compare people at the same point in life. So let's talk for just a minute about millennial economics. Some of the things that we asked or we've looked at that have impacted them are things like education costs, healthcare costs, and housing costs. So we know that as they have been aging and reaching middle age, they've dealt with rising tuition costs, student loan debt, rising premiums, deductibles that are outpacing wage growth and inflation. There have been low interest rates until recently, but there's also been low supply and a lot of demand, particularly in a lot of urban areas. So housing is an issue that a lot of millennials are concerned about. When we think about more business cycle issues, you know, after the 2008 recession, when many of them were coming into the job market, there was a sort of depressed situation for them to get on the ladder of career advancement. It's been good for many skill sets, but it hasn't been particularly good for wage labor until very recently. So there's been a division in opportunities among millennials as they've been aging as well. And then we look at things like inflation, domestic policy, and global policy. You know, inflation, yes, it's been low. You know, we'll see what happens. But we've also been moving in from a less regulatory, more free trade environment into a much more interventionist and much more polarized and nationalistic environment. So that loops back to this idea about how we've been dropping in the economic freedom index, right, as these sort of changes have taken place. So this is just a framework. I just wanted to get a framework for millennials as they've sort of become adults and moved into this first part of their life as they're sort of reaching the age of 40. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So let's look at some of the economics, millennial economics. When we ask them about parental support, we find that almost 60% of Gen Z still have some form of parental support, and when we ask them this question in surveys, right? And so we're talking about a demographically representative sample that we do with YouGov, a nationally representative sample with YouGov. So we feel like these data are pretty good for this age group. Younger millennials, we see it starts to drop. Older millennials, it drops a little more, but we're still talking about a quarter of our sample that are receiving some form of parental support. Home ownership, that's another important category. Overall, home ownership for millennials has been about 43% in 2019. But when we look at that using data again, and we compare it to baby boomers at around the same age, so let's say millennials at age 38 and baby boomers at age 38, baby boomers, about 65% of them own their homes, and for silent generation, it was about 71%. So again, the sort of sliding scale that we're looking at. Marriage, one of these impacts of delayed adulthood is sort of delaying marriage, delaying families. The average age for millennials at the first marriage is about 30. About 40% of baby boomers were married when they were in the 18 to 30 age group, and the average age of marriage for baby boomers was around 21. Just the idea of women with kids at home. Again, 50% or more of boomer women had their first kids by the age of 25, and 75 to 80% had kids by age 30. When we're talking about younger millennials and older millennials, again, lower rates of starting families and sort of moving into that environment that, again, creates that stability that comes with work, family, accumulation of assets, and things like that. So health insurance, about 82% of millennials currently have health insurance. So there's still a significant number that don't. So what happens when we ask millennials about their perceptions of, this is sort of their economic, worldview, and when we ask them about their perceptions about how these issues are contributing to things like a stable society, how does this contribute to a stable society, we get answers. So how big a problem is falling to a stable society? Cost of college, very strong response that this is a big problem when we're talking about contributions to a stable society. It's very difficult to get educated. It's expensive to get educated. We know education is very important for meritocracy and continuing to advance people. Cost of buying a house, another big issue. Of course, they feel like this is contributing. It's undermining stability. Health care, worker wages, important. The quality of jobs available. You see this starts to diminish, right? We're starting to diminish. So it's not that the jobs out there aren't good, or there isn't interesting work available. Existence of very rich. Half the people think this is some kind of problem. I mean, half of them don't care. That's what we have to see. The other side of the coin, half of them think this is sort of a problem, and half of them don't care, right? So that's the other side of the coin. Kids inheriting from their parents. Most people don't care about that either, right? So it's the issues that keep emerging are around these things about the cost of being able to accumulate the things that they think they need, homes, healthcare, that kind of stuff. Okay. So with that sort of framework, I want to talk a little bit about millennials and liberalism. There's of course different ways to assess the underlying ideas that we think of as the building blocks of American liberalism, and of course that's what the John Locke Society talks about. That's what's on the web page. What is a free society? The idea that the natural rights of individuals should supersede the power of the state. We live in a free society where worship, speech, ability to assemble, all this is very important. Limited power of the government, and then of course the idea that we live in a free market society, and free markets provide opportunity for people, right? So that's the thing that we really want to talk about. That's what I'll talk about in the next section when I talk about capitalism, but let's talk about the other stuff for a minute here. Okay. Another framework for this is the idea that these concepts, here's another millennial joke. To all the millennials who feel stressed out sometimes, try not to worry. Just think about the future where things will be much worse. We hope that's not true, right? Okay. Here's another framework that I want to just talk a little bit about. It's a visual representation of the tensions that emerge between democracy, capitalism, and sort of the underlying libertarian concept of egalitarianism. And by egalitarianism, I mean that we want free choice in our political and economic lives, and this comes from a core belief that we have an equality, that everyone has the same worth in society, and everyone should fundamentally have equal rights, right? So the egalitarianism, this idea of equal moral worth of people, with democracy and capitalism, you get this tension between the individual and society, right? We know that tension, and we know how that sort of can manifest itself at different times in different places. So this is a schematic that two social scientists working in the 1980s, 1990s came up with to sort of demonstrate how, mostly in the U.S., we've had our conflicts around in this sort of range, right? Capitalism keeps us from moving into communism and collectivism. It pulls us away from that. Democracy pulls us away from the sort of pure, unfettered capitalist system that we can read about in Ayn Rand and other places, but we probably won't get it anytime soon in the U.S. So does that make sense? There's sort of this tension, and okay. So these things, of course, all of these values are aspirational. And the other thing I want to point out that is common in polls, and sometimes is perhaps not given enough attention among social scientists, is that a lot of these values are aspirational, and there's disconnects between what people will tell you is appropriate individual behavior and what's appropriate behavior for a group or a collective standard, right? So as an example, if when Gallup asks people, do you believe in freedom of speech? Well, they've asked that question for decades. And since the 1930s, like 97% of Americans agree with the statement, I believe in freedom of speech in America, okay? But it's when you sort of ask them the questions about the details of freedom of speech that you get a lot of this division in between the idealized and the standard that they think should be adhered to. So with follow-up questions like, do you believe that fascists and communists should hold meetings and express their views in the community? Well, those questions you get like 22% of people agreeing, right? So there's always a disconnect between the idealized views and what people think should actually be the community standard and how that plays out. So we can pick up on that in surveys, and that gives us interesting information. So I just want to go through a couple of these questions and what we've learned, again, from asking these. So we're just talking about millennials now. We ask millennials, most people are trustworthy. Well, you can see that there's actually a fairly low number of them that feel that people are trustworthy. So that plays into this idea of having fairly low trust, overall trust in folks. I would not trust any person to decide what opinions can be expressed and what must be silenced. Pretty high number of people agree with that, right? That's sort of, do you believe in freedom of speech kind of question. Most Americans are more moderate in their views than what is shown in media. A pretty high number, about 60% agree with that. The neutral category is a category that we use, and what it tells us is that that's not something that the people who choose neutral feel very strongly for or against. It really does mean neutral, okay? So in this sense, our laws should aim to enforce the community standards of right and wrong. You can see a fairly high number agree with that. I should be able to say what I like on social media, even if others find it offensive, as long as I do not threaten anyone with physical harm. Pretty high number of people agree with that. Again, this going into this idea that people should be able to say and act. Here we have the fascist, neo-Nazis, and other extreme groups should be allowed to hold public meetings and marches, and we see this disconnect, right, in terms of the actual practice of freedom of speech. Voting gives people like me some say in how the government runs things. Fairly high number of agreement. Elected representatives usually vote based on the will of the people. Again. So, okay. So overall, and then let me talk about this one for a minute. How do you rate the power of the federal government, big business, and media? Well, what we see here is that most millennials don't think the federal government needs to have more power, right? I mean, very few of them think that the federal government has too little power. Of course, when we look at big business and media, there's a lot of concern about the level of power that big business and media have in society, and even the level that the federal government has in society, currently wields in society, right? So millennials aren't demonstrating in some of these areas as significantly different than what we would expect from older generations when they were in. Oh, what did I do? Okay, when they were in. What did I? Oh, sorry about that. There we go. Oh, okay. Let's see. That's not. Yeah. Let's see. How do I need to get it to the screen, to the full screen again. If it's not displaying here. Yeah.
Unplug, plug back in.
Oh.
Options.
That's better. Yeah.
It's mirroring the wrong way.
Oh. Sorry.
Okay. We want you to see, but we want to mirror it the other way.
Maybe that'll do it. Well, I can just go with that. Let me see if it'll change. Okay, it's fine. We'll just go with this. Yeah, sorry about that, guys. Okay. Let's see. Let me move on to where we are. All right. Okay. All right. Okay. Let's talk for a few minutes about millennials and capitalism then, to see what perceptions we're capturing around capitalism. Here's my last millennial joke for you. Why do millennials always type in lowercase? Somebody knows this. Do you know the answer? No? No? Why do millennials always type in lowercase? Because they reject capitalism. All right. All right. These are questions that we've asked millennials that get to some of the core ideas that we think of around a mental construct about support for free markets. Okay, so ideas about competition, ideas about whether wealth can grow and resources can grow, and we can live in a society that is progressive in that sense. Whether their views about profit, whether it's okay to make a profit, the idea that under a competitive economic system, people who have more capabilities or education or experience in certain areas would earn more than other people. So how do you think about that in a competitive economic system? And then just views about private property, right? So is private property something that should be part of our society? Do you support sort of the idea of private property? So let's just look at these one by one. Wealth can grow, so there's enough for everyone. And I'm comparing, in this case, millennials to Gen Z, the survey results we have for the younger generation. So you can see how they look and how millennials are changed a little bit. Wealth can grow, so there's enough for everyone. So about 55% of millennials agree with that. When businesses are allowed to make as much money as they can, everyone profits in the long run. Lower rates of agreement, a lot of it has to do with their views about big business, right? The role of big business in society and the impact of big business on society. Competition. Competition is good. It stimulates people to work hard and develop new ideas. Pretty high rates of agreement with that idea. The profit system teaches people the value of hard work and success. You know, 50-ish% agreement with that. More people that are sort of more neutral about that. Again, we're talking about this delayed adulthood concept where they're not fully engaged in the economy in some cases, as when we're looking at them compared to older generations. Under fair economic system, people with more abilities would earn higher salaries. Fairly high rate of agreement with that. And the way private property is used should primarily be decided by its owner. Again, pretty high rate of agreement with that. So again, like this is just a sample of many, many questions that we're asking. And when we're diving deep into these analyses, we're looking at, we're comparing responses. And I don't have data right now about who's agreeing and who's disagreeing, right? If it has to do with economy, education, you know, other ethnicity and other things like that. So, but this isn't particularly horrible. I mean, and it looks like millennials are even maybe getting a little better than the younger group. So, you know, so, you know, we have something going here. Okay. The last thing I want to talk about is the idea of looking at people from ideological versus political perspectives. And this is something that has come out more and more, I think, in these discussions among social scientists who are interested in millennials as a generation and baby boomers, Gen Xers also. What does this mean? I mean, this is a really interesting area of work, and so I just want to show you on the left, when we look at millennials and Gen Z, we see that many of them identify as Democrats, right? That's probably to be expected. A little less than Gen Z. Many of them also identify as independent, and this is our data on Democrat means anyone who says they're Democrat, says they lean Democrat, or says they're sort of slightly Democrat. Independent are people that just say, no, I'm an independent. And Republican, again, is people that are strong Republican, lean Republican, sort of identify Republican kind of stuff. You know, we see that there's some movement, again, which we would expect as people age. But there's a very strong number of folks in here that feel like they're independent and feel like these systems, these parties, for some reason, maybe aren't working for them. When we look at ideology, it's an interesting picture, because people who think they're really liberal, I mean, the liberal and the Democrats, that's not the same thing, right? So what is that? I mean, we can talk about what that is, and we may have ideas about what that is. People who feel like they're moderates, There, we see that is a pretty strong group. And people who feel like they're conservative, again, that's a small group, but what does that mean for conservative, right? Ideologically conservative. And then we have a bunch of people who don't even know what their ideology is. So there's another area that needs some investigation. Okay, so this is really just to point out that it's not as simple, you know, these things aren't quite as simple with this group, and I would say not for any group. All right, here's a couple of questions that we also ask them. Best hope for future of humankind lies in science and human reason. The first number is the number that agree. The second is the number that actually disagree with the statement. Okay, so only 11% of them actually disagree that science and reason is probably the major. I mean, we could probably ask people who were much older and probably get about the same level of disagreement, okay? Political freedom and economic freedom depend on one another. Again, it's a pretty low number of people that actually disagree. So I'm not saying that millennials are the loudest voice in support for free markets, but what I am saying is I don't think they're missing all the fundamentals. I think that areas that we need to really think about are what are keeping them from being active supporters of things like free markets, right? What is it about their experience that's keeping them from this? So a few takeaways: the delayed adulthood aspect of young adulthood is likely here to stay. So this age between 18 and 26, we're going to probably continue to see this as part of the human experience for a while. It's actually, before the 1900s, before the sort of last big boom, that wasn't really an unusual way to live. It's still not an unusual way to live in a lot of parts of the world. I mean, a lot of people don't leave their parents' homes until they get married, have enough assets to start their own families, and that's later in life than it has been when we're benchmarking to baby boomer generations. So we might expect that this is going to be part of our society for a while. Young people have less conviction in their views of free markets. Young people have elevated expectations about their needs, including healthcare, housing, and education. So again, going back to these, capitalism has been really good to America, and it has provided us with different ideas in past generations about our level of expectation in areas about how we should be taken care of, in our healthcare, what kind of housing we should have access to, and how we should be able to access education. So my grandparents didn't think about healthcare the way that my kids think about healthcare, right? They had shorter lifespans. They didn't have the same financial issues. So these are really important areas, I think. Again, business people can get involved in educating young people about capitalism, particularly during these post-college years from 21 to 26. So not everyone goes to college in the US. But what we, I think, can't expect anymore is that institutions of higher education are going to do all the training in capitalism, because they're coming out at 21, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26. They're getting jobs, and they really, a lot of them, the businesses don't think that they need to help people understand sometimes the value of free markets, because you're in a free, you're working in a business, you're in a free market, but that's not really the case anymore. So one of the things that the center is trying to do is to work closely with the business community to help us think about how can higher education work with business folks to make sure that young people are continuing to be educated about the value of free markets, right? Some data suggests millennials are becoming more moderate. I mean, I've showed you a few things here. We have other stuff. We'll see what happens as they get into their 40s. We'll see what happens, of course, with all these contextual issues that are happening in the world, too. And I would say that economic success contributes to economic conservatism more than social conservatism. So we're not going to expect a lot of backtracking among millennials and their views about racial equality or gender equality or things like that. But our focus really is on this more economic component of it. I just would like to thank you, and my board also thanks you. This is a board of the Center for the Study of Capitalism. Mr. Warren Stevens, Mr. John Allison, Mr. Billy Prim have been phenomenal supporters of our organization and very active in the center and what we do. So have been great to work with. And this is our website, of course, and we're happy to add you to our newsletter. We do LinkedIn, Twitter, and Instagram, and put a lot of data. So all the research that I've been discussing today, we publish in white papers, or we publish in other papers that we post on the center's website, besides the sort of more academic stuff that the center produces from the data. So we just put up a paper about millennial views on student loan debt from some of the data we just collected. And I'm happy to talk about some of the other work that the center does. But I'll just leave it there, and we have a few minutes for questions. Okay.
If you want, or I can ask.
Go ahead. Yes.
Can you tell me a little bit about the history of the center and what has its reception been like on campus?
Yeah, so I started in January 2020. I was there for 3 months, and then the entire school shut down for COVID, right? So everything before that is sort of in the distant past. I mean, in a way. We've also had a lot of turnover. We have a new president, we have a new provost, we have a new dean in the business school, a lot of turnover in that level of leadership. The center has been at Wake Forest as part of the business school for, I think it was 10 years before 2020. So John started it with the BB&T funding almost a decade before, and it has gone through several different iterations. It usually had a very research-oriented focus. The last director, Jim Otteson, left the center to do a different center called the Eudynamia Institute. Did that for a few years, then left and went to Notre Dame. So I would say, in terms of your question about the reception, it's part of the fabric of Wake Forest. A lot of students come to the center to engage with us in research. We have a class that we teach in the business school that's actually open to anyone called Foundations of Capitalism and Contemporary Issues in Capitalism. We have another class that I launched this fall called Finding Your Value Proposition, which actually most of the kids in that class are kids that are not business school kids. So, you know, I can't speak a lot about what me before I was there, but I can talk more about how I've been received. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes, sir.
Yeah, tell me more about the sampling, the size of what you were dealing with as far as the poll, et cetera. Was it primarily U.S. or was it international?
No, it's just U.S. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, so we collect data through YouGov. YouGov does the data collection for us. The margin of error is about 2.2%. The size of the sample is at least 2,000. And it's 18 to, so it's just Gen Z and millennials.
Is there, I don't know if this is in your area, but is there other research internationally on generational stuff that would, you know, serve as a point of comparison, like with, say, European millennials, et cetera, things like that? You know of that? Is that?
There is, and some of it is in different places like the World Values Survey, or there's other places, and one of the things that we'd like to work towards is actually having a conference for folks that are looking at this kind of stuff at Wake Forest, and just bring people together so we can identify all the different people that are doing this kind of work, specifically looking at millennials and Gen Z, since there is a real difference. I mean, you know, I feel like I'm not a millennial. I mean, I'm a Gen Xer, right? So I feel like there is a shift after sort of baby boomer Gen X are into millennials, and it's interesting. They're an interesting group. Yes, sir.
So staying on that same thing, when was the data collected from when to when?
So the way the data is collected is the survey goes out, let's say in July. This last survey went out in July.
July of last year.
Of this year. Yeah, this year. Yeah, we did a survey also last year in July, and it takes about 2 weeks for them to collect the data. So they have a standing, standing polling whatever of like 2 million people that are part of the YouGov polling network, and they cross-reference the sample with census data and other data, so that's how they create the demographically representative sample. So people respond to the survey, and then they go through and they narrow down the responses to get the right kind of cross-section. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, it'd be very interesting in light of the Ukraine war, the inflation, the most recent dynamic in macroeconomics worldwide, to see next July what change there is in this, because I would think there might be quite a bit as people are much more uncertain about their own personal economic futures.
That's a good point, and we have some short polls. This is a very long. This is a survey that we've done for the past 2 years. Is pretty long, and we're thinking about doing some shorter ones, just to be able to capture snippets like that, right? Yeah, responses to these conditions. Yes, sir. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Are there other universities that have a similar organization that you collaborate with or communicate with on a regular basis?
So it's interesting. We're very focused on a couple of things. One is capitalism and democracy, right? So future of capitalism and the relationship between capitalism and democracy. And so I would say at the bigger level, it's not just the millennial and Gen Z stuff. It really is a sort of future of capitalism. And there's a couple places that have started to think more about that. One of them is actually in Georgetown. It's the Denny Center for Democratic Capitalism. It's in the law school. And it's a new center. They put out a very interesting report where they went back and assessed, I think, a decade of data that they got from all different places, and had some leading economists sort of come in and comment on to talk about changes in the relationship between democracy and capitalism. So they're sort of in this future of capitalism kind of space as well. Yes, sir.
Based on your background, what is your expectation that capitalism will continue to be the primary economic system of the United States in 20 years or so?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually fairly optimistic. So, I mean, markets, if you think about it, markets are the foundation of modern society. I mean, we live in, since for many years now, I mean, markets are the core mechanism that maintain and sustain society, right? So everything, markets are a precursor for democracy. It doesn't mean that just because you have markets, you're going to get democracy, but there is a realization. I think we have to continue to work really hard on this realization about the relationship between political and economic freedom, right? And if we keep doing that, then and really understand what free markets are, because millennials are not. A lot of them don't quite. They haven't lived in a free market society, right? So it'll be interesting. We've all seen that the UK's decided that they're going full on in free markets, right? So, we'll see, right? I mean, the people realize that too little market is really not a good case for anybody, right? Yes, sir.
This is sort of a repetition of that question and seeking you giving the same answer. But my impression is that the U.S. sentiment has actually turned radically left, say, in the past 10 or 20 years, to the point where I would be pessimistic about the prospects for free markets prevailing. But, but your survey results seem to be less to that effect, as did your answer just a minute ago. And is that sort of where you're coming from in response to my concern?
I think that it's important to separate out the social issues from the underlying economic mindset. And that's what we're trying to get a better sense of. There are a lot of social issues in terms of, I'm not saying that there aren't things that need to be worked out, but I'm not sure that that's coming from, I think, again, that's coming from a subset of folks when we're talking about this radical economic shift to the left, right? So we just need to address that. What is that and why is that? And is that really making an impact on, is that helping these people? Like, is that really going to help solve the healthcare issue? Yeah, I think we have other ways to solve that, right? Okay, yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned kind of the logical inconsistency of the I support free speech, but I don't support free speech for these people. Are there, I know because this is a much longer survey, are there any other kind of inconsistencies in the data or kind of like maybe line drawing, if you don't want to call it an inconsistency, that people have maybe not in the millennials or just anywhere in the data?
Yeah, and I want to make sure it's not just the millennials. Everybody's like this. It's just the way we are. And it depends on what we're talking about, right? So there are other areas like that, and I don't want to. Usually it's this idea about communities, individual rights, like what's okay for me. So like when we ask them, should I be able to negotiate any wage I can from my employer? Well, like 100% of them agree with that, right? But then, when you sort of ask these questions about like, are we worried about the existence of rich people and, this other stuff. So it's always this thing about what works for me and what where am I with the sort of community standards or vision. So you have to address that somehow, right? Yeah, the self-interest issue. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hi, I was curious to learn your thoughts on this. Had a conversation with a friend who teaches at Duke Business School and prompted with the conversation, can you teach entrepreneurship or are you born an entrepreneur? And so it evolved into this conversation. I was curious to know your thoughts. He says there will no longer be a free market because Adam Smith wrote his works during the age of mercantilism. Mercantilism doesn't exist anymore, but he fears that we live in a different world with big tech, Facebook.
Yeah.
Like that. So I was curious to learn your thoughts regarding that point.
Right.
He says there will always be like a public-private partnership.
Right. Oh, that private business will just disappear.
Well, not disappear, but there'll be markets, but there won't be a free market.
Got it. Yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly won't have the answer, but I'll just, the part about the entrepreneurship, Wake Forest entrepreneurship is the most popular minor. One of the ways that entrepreneurship often is taught is very methodological. And so we talk about the entrepreneurial mindset, and there's a lot of overlap with that mindset and what we would consider a free market or capitalist mindset, right? Because entrepreneurs obviously don't exist without capitalism. I mean, it's silly to teach people to be entrepreneurs if they don't have a free market society to work in. So the question of whether or not entrepreneurship and business formation and innovation and all this stuff is going to continue is complicated because millennials are reaching an age where most people start businesses in their 40s. So if millennials don't have the right economic support system, or they don't feel like they can take on the risk, or they're not confident or optimistic about the system they live in, then we would expect that business formation and that kind of innovation may not keep up with what we've seen in past generations, right? So that's that's potentially a problem that we would want to address or think about how to address it. Does that help answer your question?
It does. I was left a little befuddled after my conversation
Yeah.
with him too, but yeah, he thinks you can teach someone to become an entrepreneur, like a skill set, and then the counter argument was that is it and something innate in a person if they're an entrepreneur, but then you said that entrepreneurship can only exist within a capitalistic world, and that makes
Yeah.
that makes sense.
I think you can teach people to be entrepreneurs, but if they don't have a framework to do it in, then it's hard. That supportive framework to do it, right? One more, okay.
Well, that kind of reminds me, I love to watch the PragerU interviews on campuses, and they will ask these young people if they believe in capitalism, and they'll say, oh, absolutely not, capitalism's awful. And then they'll ask them, well, what do you think about entrepreneurs? Oh, yeah, that's great. And they clearly have no idea what capitalism is.
Yeah.
I mean, we should be teaching this in elementary school because we're illiterate when it comes to economics.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I like to say, I have to go to this thing later, and often young people say, well, why can't we be more like Norway or Sweden or something like that? And I'm like, okay, well, Norway and Sweden have a better economic freedom than right now. They're higher on the economic freedom index than we are. So yeah, we should be more like them, because anyway. So there's ways I think into the argument, but you're right. You're absolutely right. There's just sort of a disconnect.
Well,
about
I ordered my grandchildren a new series called The Tuttle Twins.
Mm-hmm.
It's put out by the Libertas Institute. And they are just absolutely fabulous little books that explain free market economics. And my 9-year-old grandson is just eating it up. He's figured it out.
Well, that's
so
good.
I know I got a capitalist coming along. That's one.
That's good. That's good. Well, congratulations. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you for your attention. I appreciate that, and happy to answer any questions. Sorry for the mishap.